There is a moment in every emotionally exhausting connection when something inside you finally changes. Not because you stopped loving, not because you suddenly became cold, not because you found somebody else, but because you became tired of abandoning yourself just to keep somebody else comfortable. And that is the moment everything changes. For the longest time, the avoidant may have believed your attention was guaranteed. Your messages would always be there, your concern would always be there, your patience would always be there. Even after distance, silence, mixed signals, and emotional withdrawal, they could assume that eventually you would come back, but then one day you don't. You don't chase, you don't explain, you don't check. You don't try to decode every silence. You simply turn your attention back toward your own life. And that's when something unexpected begins to happen. There is a moment when silence stops being something you fear and becomes something that reveals the truth. For a long time, you may have been the person keeping the connection alive. When they pulled away, you reached out. When they became distant, you tried to understand. When they stopped communicating, you searched for the perfect words to bring them closer again. You were constantly responding to their absence with more of your presence. And because you always responded, they never had to fully experience what their withdrawal actually created. They knew you cared. They knew you would notice. They knew that eventually you might check in, send a message, ask what was wrong, or try one more time to repair the emotional distance. But then something changes. You stop, not dramatically, not to punish them, not to manipulate them. You simply stop giving your emotional energy to a situation that keeps leaving you exhausted. And that silence feels different. Because this time, there is no emotional reaction waiting for them on the other side of their distance. They may look at their phone and notice there is no message from you. They may wonder why you haven't checked in. They may revisit the conversations you once had. They may notice that the person who used to respond immediately is no longer available in the same way. At first, they might assume it's temporary. They may think you're upset and will eventually come back. They may tell themselves you're trying to get their attention, but as the days pass and your behavior remains consistent, something becomes harder to ignore. Your attention is no longer centered around them. And that is where the emotional dynamic begins to shift. Because people can become accustomed to receiving your energy without consciously recognizing its value. Your concern can become familiar. Your patience can become expected. Your constant availability can become part of their emotional environment. They may not have realized how much comfort existed in knowing that you were always there, until suddenly you aren't. Now they have to experience the quiet they once created for themselves. And this is not about making an avoidant person suffer. It is about understanding the difference between chasing someone and allowing reality to speak for itself. When you stop chasing, you remove the noise. There are no more explanations, no more emotional paragraphs, no more attempts to convince them that you are worth choosing, no more trying to solve a problem they refuse to acknowledge. And without all that noise, they are left with their own thoughts. They may begin asking questions they avoided before. Why aren't they reaching out? Did they finally move on? Do they not care anymore? Did I push them too far? Could I actually lose them? Those questions may never be spoken aloud, but that doesn't mean they aren't being felt. And here's where you must protect yourself. Don't turn your healing into a surveillance mission where you're constantly watching for signs that they noticed your absence. That keeps you emotionally connected to the same cycle. The real transformation happens when you stop needing evidence that they noticed. You don't need to know whether they checked your profile. You don't need to know whether they reread your messages. You don't need to know whether they're secretly missing you. Your responsibility is not to monitor their reaction. Your responsibility is to reclaim your attention, because attention is one of the most powerful resources you possess. Where your attention goes, your emotional energy follows. And if your attention has been trapped in someone else's silence, it is time to bring it home. Bring it back to your goals. Bring it back to your confidence. Bring it back to your family, your work, your dreams, your health, your future. Let them experience the natural consequence of your absence while you experience the freedom of your presence in your own life. That is when silence stops being a weapon. It becomes a boundary. And a boundary doesn't scream. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't chase. It simply says, this is no longer where I am willing to lose myself. And once you genuinely reach that place, something powerful happens inside you. Their silence may still exist, but it no longer controls yours. There is a difference between losing your presence and losing access to your presence. When you were always available, they may have become comfortable knowing that no matter how distant they became, there was still a connection waiting for them. They could step back, disappear emotionally, become quiet, and still assume that your care would remain exactly where they left it. But when you stop chasing, something changes. They don't simply notice that you're quieter. They begin to experience life without the emotional access they once had to you. Your attention is no longer automatically available. Your reassurance is no longer guaranteed. Your energy is no longer constantly moving in their direction. And suddenly, the relationship they thought they could pause whenever they wanted begins to feel different. This is where curiosity can appear. They may wonder what you're doing. They may wonder why you're not checking in. They may wonder whether you finally stopped waiting. And sometimes that question is uncomfortable because your absence removes a form of emotional security they had grown accustomed to. Think about what happens when something is always available. You don't necessarily stop appreciating it because it has no value. You simply stop noticing how valuable it is because you have never had to live without it. Your presence may have become familiar. Your patience may have become familiar. Your forgiveness may have become familiar. Even your attempts to understand them may have become familiar. But familiarity can hide value. Then one day the pattern changes. You don't send the message. You don't ask why they disappeared. You don't try to restart the conversation. You don't rush to repair the distance. And suddenly they have a different experience of you. This does not mean every avoidant person will immediately chase you. It doesn't mean they will suddenly become emotionally available. And it certainly doesn't mean you should withdraw just to provoke a reaction. That's the trap. If you disappear only because you want them to panic, you're still emotionally controlled by their response. True detachment sounds different. It sounds like, I'm not doing this anymore because it cost me too much. That decision carries a completely different energy. You are no longer trying to create a reaction. You're creating a new standard, and that standard may become noticeable. Maybe they reach out casually. Maybe they ask how you've been. Maybe they suddenly become more curious about your life. Maybe they test whether the old version of you is still available. This is where your emotional discipline matters. Don't mistake a knock on the door for a rebuilt house. A message is not commitment. Missing you is not emotional maturity. Curiosity is not consistency. And regret is not the same thing as change. If they return, watch the pattern. Do their actions match their words? Are they communicating more clearly? Are they taking responsibility? Are they showing consistency instead of appearing only when they feel lonely? Are they willing to build something healthier? Those questions matter more than whether they suddenly say, I miss you. Because the goal isn't to become someone they are afraid to lose. The goal is to become someone who knows what they deserve. And once you understand that, their access to you becomes something earned through consistency rather than automatically granted through history. You don't need revenge. You don't need games. You don't need to make them jealous. You don't need to prove that you're doing better. You simply continue living. You continue growing. You continue becoming more emotionally grounded. And the beautiful thing is that the more you build your own life, the less their reaction determines your emotional state. Maybe they recognize your value. Maybe they don't. Maybe they return ready to do things differently. Maybe they return carrying the same patterns. Your job remains the same. Protect the person you've worked so hard to become. Because the greatest shift isn't when someone finally realizes they lost access to you. It's when you realize that access to you should never have been given at the cost of your peace. For a long time, you may have felt like your emotional future was sitting in someone else's hands. You were waiting for their decision, their message, their commitment, their next move. You wondered whether they would finally open up, whether they would finally understand what you meant to them, whether they would finally stop running whenever the connection became emotionally serious. And without realizing it, you began living in the waiting room of someone else's uncertainty. Every day became another question. Will they call? Will they come back? Did the first say something wrong? Should the first reach out? Should the first give them more space? Maybe tomorrow will be different. But eventually something inside you gets tired of waiting. Not tired of loving. Tired of putting your life on hold. And that is the moment the power begins to shift. Because when you stop waiting for someone to decide your worth, you start making decisions for yourself. You stop asking, how can I make them choose me? You start asking, what kind of relationship do I choose? That is a completely different question. The first question puts your power outside of you. The second brings it home. Suddenly, their silence isn't an instruction for you to chase them. Their uncertainty isn't your responsibility to solve. Their fear isn't something you have to manage. Their emotional distance isn't proof that you're not enough. You begin to understand something incredibly important. Someone else's inability to show up consistently is information about their capacity, not a measurement of your value. And once you understand that, your behavior changes. You don't send the extra message because you're afraid they might forget you. You don't over-explain yourself because you're desperate to be understood. You don't lower your standards because you're afraid that having standards will make them leave. You don't accept crumbs simply because you remember the moments when they gave you a full meal. You begin looking at the entire pattern. And this can be surprising for someone who is used to having your attention, because the old version of you might have reacted immediately. The new version pauses. The old version asked, "What do they need from me?" The new version asks, "What do I need from this relationship?" The old version feared losing them. The new version starts fearing losing yourself. That is the turning point. And when they notice that you're no longer waiting, they may become curious about what changed. They may wonder why you seem calmer. Why aren't you reacting? Why aren't you chasing? Why aren't you trying to convince them? Why does it feel like you're moving forward without them? But don't make the mistake of changing your behavior just because you think they're watching. This isn't about creating a performance, it's about becoming authentic. If you are genuinely moving forward, you don't need to announce it. Your life will demonstrate it. Your confidence will demonstrate it. Your boundaries will demonstrate it. Your peace will demonstrate it. And if they eventually return, you don't have to rush back into the old dynamic. You can slow down. You can observe. You can ask better questions. You can look for consistency. Because now you're not waiting for someone to decide whether you're worth loving. You're deciding whether their presence belongs in the life you've built. That is a powerful difference. It means their return doesn't automatically become your victory. Their attention doesn't automatically become your validation. Their desire doesn't automatically become your permission to abandon your standards. You can care without chasing. You can love without losing yourself. You can forgive without reopening every door. And you can miss someone without making them the center of your world. When you reach that level of emotional freedom, something remarkable happens. You stop measuring your future by whether they come back. You start measuring it by how much more alive you feel when you stop waiting. And that is when your life begins moving forward again. Not because someone finally chose you, but because you finally chose yourself. There is a moment when your absence does something your presence never could. It removes the cushion that allowed the other person to avoid facing what was happening inside them. When you were always there, you may have unknowingly helped maintain the emotional balance of the connection. Whenever they pulled away, you reached toward them. Whenever communication became difficult, you tried to repair it. Whenever they became distant, you searched for explanations. You carried conversations they weren't carrying, repaired emotional gaps they weren't repairing, and sometimes took responsibility for feelings that were never yours to carry. But when you stop doing that, something changes. The emotional space is no longer being filled by your effort, and suddenly they have to sit with what their own behavior created. This doesn't mean they immediately have some dramatic realization. People don't always confront themselves the moment someone walks away. Sometimes they become defensive. Sometimes they distract themselves. Sometimes they convince themselves that everything is fine. But when the distractions become quiet, reality has a way of becoming louder. They may begin remembering the moments when you tried to communicate and they avoided the conversation. They may remember how often you gave them another chance. They may remember how patiently you waited while they figured out what they wanted. They may remember the emotional safety they experienced simply because they knew you cared, and now that source of reassurance isn't automatically available. That's uncomfortable. Because when someone has become accustomed to avoiding emotional responsibility, another person's constant effort can unintentionally protect them from the consequences of that avoidance. You were always there to restart the conversation. You were always there to soften the conflict. You were always there to explain your feelings again. You were always there to make the relationship feel alive, but now there is no one doing that work for them. And this is where they may finally encounter themselves. Not the version of themselves they show the world, not the version they use to explain why relationships are difficult, but the deeper patterns underneath it. Why do I pull away when someone gets close? Why do I become distant when emotions become intense? Why do I want connection and then fear it when I actually receive it? Why did I push away someone who genuinely cared? Those questions can be uncomfortable because they don't allow someone to blame the relationship forever. Eventually, they have to look at the pattern. But here's something you must understand. You cannot force someone into self-awareness. You cannot lecture them into emotional maturity. You cannot love someone hard enough to make them confront themselves. You can only stop participating in the cycle. And that is why your growth matters more than your explanation. When you stop rescuing the connection, you give reality room to speak. If they truly value you, they have an opportunity to recognize what they lost and take responsibility. If they don't, you have an opportunity to recognize that too. Either way, you gain clarity. And clarity is powerful. Because before, you may have been confused by potential. You saw who they could become. You focused on the moments when they were loving, warm, attentive, and connected. But now you begin looking at consistency. Not promises, not chemistry, not memories, consistency. You ask yourself whether this person can actually meet you emotionally, not whether you can survive another round of emotional distance. That question changes the entire relationship because you are no longer trying to convince them to become ready. You're observing whether they already are. And if they return, your response doesn't need to be anger or excitement. It can be calm, you can listen, you can watch, you can allow their actions to tell you what their words cannot, because real change doesn't appear in one emotional conversation. It appears repeatedly. It shows up in communication. It shows up in accountability. It shows up when things become uncomfortable. It shows up when vulnerability requires courage. It shows up when disappearing would be easier, but they choose to stay and communicate. That's the difference between someone who simply misses your presence and someone who has actually grown enough to value it. And your job is not to create that growth. Your job is to protect your own. The moment you stop carrying someone else's emotional responsibility, you create space for both people to face the truth of what they bring into a relationship. And sometimes, that truth is exactly what neither person could see while you were still desperately trying to keep everything together. There comes a point where something inside you becomes stronger than your need for someone else's validation. You still remember them. You may still care. You may even have moments when you miss them deeply. But something has changed. Their attention no longer determines how you feel about yourself. Their silence no longer convinces you that you're not enough. Their distance no longer sends you into emotional panic. And their return no longer automatically feels like proof that you finally won. That is real freedom. For a long time, you may have unconsciously connected your worth to their behavior. If they texted, you felt important. If they pulled away, you questioned yourself. If they became affectionate, you felt secure. If they became cold, you wondered what you had done wrong. Your emotional state was constantly being controlled by someone else's actions. But eventually, you realize that you cannot build a peaceful life while handing someone else the remote control to your emotions. So you take it back. You stop asking, why don't they choose me? You start asking, am I choosing myself? You stop asking, how can I make them understand my value? Or you start asking, why am I trying to convince someone to recognize something I should already recognize in myself? That shift is enormous, because when you genuinely know your worth, you don't have to announce it. You don't need to prove you're valuable. You don't need to make someone jealous. You don't need to create a dramatic disappearance. You don't need to post a perfect life hoping they'll notice. You simply live differently. You protect your peace differently. You communicate differently. You set boundaries differently. You walk away differently. And most importantly, you stop negotiating against yourself. If someone gives you inconsistency, you don't call it potential. If someone gives you confusion, you don't call it chemistry. If someone gives you occasional affection surrounded by emotional distance, you don't automatically call it love. You begin looking at patterns instead of moments, because one beautiful conversation cannot erase months of emotional unavailability. One apology cannot replace consistent change. One "I miss you" cannot rebuild trust. And one return cannot erase the reasons you had to leave. This doesn't mean you become bitter. It means you become discerning. You can have compassion for someone and still maintain boundaries. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do without accepting behavior that continually hurts you. You can acknowledge their fears without making those fears your responsibility. And that is where emotional maturity begins. You stop trying to save people from the consequences of their own choices. If they need space, you give them space. If they choose distance, you don't chase them through it. If they refuse communication, you don't carry the entire relationship alone. And if they return, you don't immediately hand them the same access they once had. You watch, you listen, you observe, you ask yourself, whether their behavior has changed or whether their emotions have simply changed temporarily, because anybody can miss you. Anybody can feel lonely. Anybody can become nostalgic. But not everybody is capable of building a healthy relationship. And your standards must be based on capability, consistency, and character, not just emotion. This is the stage where you realize something beautiful. You don't need them to regret losing you for your life to have meaning. You don't need them to come back for your healing to be successful. You don't need them to admit they were wrong for you to know what happened. You don't need their apology to move forward. You don't need their validation because you finally gave yourself what you were asking them to give you. You gave yourself permission to be enough. You gave yourself permission to stop chasing. You gave yourself permission to want more. You gave yourself permission to leave situations that repeatedly demanded that you shrink. And once you reach that place, something becomes almost impossible to take away from you: your peace. Because now, whether they stay or go, you remain connected to yourself. And that is the real transformation. Not becoming someone they are afraid to lose. Becoming someone you refuse to lose again. Maybe the hardest part was never letting go of the avoidant. Maybe the hardest part was letting go of the version of yourself that kept waiting, chasing, explaining, forgiving, and hoping that one more effort would finally make someone choose you. But there comes a moment when you realize love should never require you to disappear inside someone else's uncertainty. You can care about someone deeply and still decide that your peace matters too. When you finally stop caring in the old way, you don't become heartless. You become free. You stop measuring your worth by their attention, their silence, or their return. You stop asking what you need to do to make them miss you, and you start asking what you need to do to become whole again. Your energy comes back, your focus comes back, your confidence comes back, and suddenly the life you were neglecting while waiting for them starts calling your name again. Maybe they notice your absence. Maybe they wonder why you stopped reaching out. Maybe they finally recognize what your presence meant. Maybe they even come back. But understand this, their reaction is no longer the destination. If they return, let their actions speak. If they apologize, watch for consistency. If they say they have changed, give time the opportunity to prove it. You don't need to punish them, and you don't need to reward them with immediate access. You simply protect the standards you built while they were gone. And if they never return, you haven't lost. Because the greatest victory was never making someone regret losing you. The greatest victory was reaching the point where their regret was no longer necessary for you to feel valuable. You stopped begging for clarity. You stopped chasing closure. You stopped waiting for someone else to give you permission to move forward. You chose yourself, and that choice can change the entire direction of your life. So walk forward with your head high. Let your silence be peace, not punishment. Let your distance be healing, not manipulation. Let your growth be real, not a performance for someone watching from a distance. Because one day, you'll look back and realize that the moment you thought you were losing them was actually the moment you were finding yourself. And when you finally stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else close, you discover the truth that changes everything. You were never waiting for them to choose you. You were waiting for yourself to choose you. Thank you for spending these moments with me and allowing this message to reach your heart. If something in these words made you pause, reflect, or see your situation differently, then remember this: your worth was never determined by someone's ability to recognize it. If this message spoke to you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear these words today. Your support helps these messages reach people who are quietly fighting battles nobody else can see. And before you leave, remember one thing: don't chase what repeatedly chooses distance. Don't destroy your peace trying to earn someone's attention. Keep growing, keep healing, and keep becoming the strongest version of yourself. Take care of your heart, protect your peace, and never forget, you don't have to be chosen by someone else to become worthy of choosing yourself. Thank you for watching. Until the next message, keep moving forward, keep believing in yourself, and keep choosing the life you deserve. Goodbye for now.